So what will we cover today? We're going to have a look at various different points in the planning process. So I'm sorry, the agenda is not updated. So we'll have a look at introduction to planning as the first point. So make sure we all have the same kind of focus on what we think planning is. Planning regulates the development of land and buildings in England. The local planning authority is the responsible body for planning policy and development control. It is to some extent a discretionary system. It is a kind of legal structure, so it operates within that kind of legal boundaries, and that's sometimes where you get slightly grey areas where it's an interpretation of the definition. So within the planning consent, what isn't considered is building regulations, any utility consents, personal circumstances, legal property matters like covenants and ownerships, and a construction programme. Why do we have a planning system? I mean, there's a lot in the news at the moment about reducing the hurdles to planning so that we can build more houses. But I think ultimately, the planning system has been put in place to strike a balance between progress, built environment progress, and preservation. So as many of you I'm sure will know, the green belt was brought in to stop the sprawl of London in the main and preserve areas of rural areas and just not have that sort of sprawl that you might see in some other countries, for example America, Australia, that type of thing. We just don't have the space for it. But I think it's kind of key things are that it makes sure that development occurs in the right places at the right time, or that's the idea, benefiting both communities and the economy. Plays a role in identifying necessary development, safeguarding those areas that need protection or enhancement, and assessing the proposed development for suitability. So again, that's where we've got those green belt designations, local, and then we have also sort of national parks and things like that. So how are planning decisions made? Well, there's a variety of different routes really, but depending on what you are asking for, will be different people that get poured in. The government sets the policy under the National Planning Policy Framework, and everything feeds off of that essentially. There is local policy, how that's interpreted locally, what the needs are locally, thinking about development needs. I'm based in Bristol, and we have a large area around the station called Temple. Well, the station called Temple Meads, but it's St Phillips. It's a light industrial area, and it's in the development zone. And over the next, I think, probably 10 to 15 years, it probably will be unrecognisable from how it is today, because there's massive proposals to improve that area, provide more green space and housing into that particular area. So that's what local policy can do. You have a council there as a sort of guidance. So within that council area, you'll have councillors that sit on different planning committees, depending on the size of the council, the areas that it covers. It may have separate committees. Again, I'll use Bristol as an example. There are two committees. There's the north and south of the river committees. So what tends to happen is particular councillors that are based in North Bristol sit on the South River planning committee, and vice versa. They shouldn't have a conflict of interest representing their own particular council areas. There are statutory consultations, so this will be, there will be statutory consultations, and then you've got those special designations. So if it's in a conservation area, if it's a listed building, the conservation area officer will need to get involved and feed into the planning decisions. So overall, there's quite a few people that come into reviewing planning decisions, and that's why it takes a little bit of time. The statutory requirement for a householder planning application is 8 weeks from the date it is approved as being received by the local councils. So it's a really important definition, because sometimes we send it off and we get a letter saying, oh, we've received your application, and you think, great, it's gone into that 8-week cycle. Until you get the confirmation that they've accepted it and they don't want additional information, it's not in that 8-week cycle. When there's a lot of planning applications, that process can really slow down, and sometimes the council can use fairly minor elements of your application that haven't been correctly completed or information provided, to push back on when that date starts, and they'll come back to you and say, oh, you need to submit this information or you need to update that. So that is not in that statutory 8-week period. So you do need to factor that into your particular planning applications and speak to your local authority to see how things are going. So let's have a look at some planning considerations. So we have sort of looked at some of these at high level already, but land use is a really key one. So we talked about development zones, and the local council will zone particular areas of your town, city, countryside for particular activities. And therefore, if you come in with a completely different proposal in that area, you may not get planning approval because it's not the right sort of designation over the land use approach. We want to have a look on the impact on your neighbours. So one of those things that again has come up time and again is where new flats are built in a city area or in the edge of a city in that kind of industrial zone where you've got nightclubs that have been there 10, 15 years. They then build a block of flats, and then the people in the block of flats complain about the noise of the nightclub. So these are the sorts of things that really need to be taken into account when we have a review on things. There's obviously the environmental impact, which has become more important over well, when was it, last year that biodiversity net gain came on board. It's not just things like trees and wildlife, but it can be energy. We've got sustainability down here, but energy, flooding, flood risk, that type of activity. Traffic and transportation, so having a look at how people are going to get to that location. Do you need to build new roads? How is that going to be? What's the demand going to be on the existing roads? That sort of thing. Heritage and conservation, we've already had a look at a little bit. Design and aesthetics, what's that building going to look like? Is it going to be something that sits into the current streetscape? Is it going to be just an identikit kind of that you can find in 14 other counties across England? That type of thing comes into play to some extent. And then there's the community benefit. So SIL money is also one of those areas where community benefits from development. So what does this mean for you as an applicant? Well, planning considerations are crucial to consider in your overarching planning application, because you need to be aware of what your local authority is saying, and you need to take account of that in your proposals that you're putting forward. If you don't, then the chances are either it's going to take a long time to get through. It's probably going to not be approved at some level. Really what you want to do is try and understand all of the principles up front, all of their conditions, so that you can work that proposal up, put in your application, and have the fewest amount of barriers in that process, and then you get your answer at the end, and then you can start delivering. So where you can, sort of understand your local planning guidance and enhance your chances of your application being approved by making sure that it's in line with that as much as it can be, and that you address all the requirements needed when you submit your planning application. So, a number of reasons why your planning application may be rejected. It could restrict your road access, negative impacts on safety, could consider overdevelopment, loss of privacy, loss of light, negative impact on trees, generally on the environment, use of hazardous materials, the character and appearance of the locality as some examples of why an application may be rejected. Okay, that's next section. We're going to have a little look at navigating the planning for planning permission. You will have heard, I'm sure, of permitted development rights. So these are kind of agreed under the Town and Country Planning Act, where you will not need to request planning approval for certain things to take place. They are generally straightforward when you're looking at houses, but may be different when it comes to converted houses and flats. So some of the things that you can do, you can install a conservatory, you can do roof alterations, extensions, loft conversions, and changes to outbuildings or hopefully installation of some outbuildings. And you shouldn't need to do a planning application for that, as long as you follow the requirements set out in the permitted development rights, which are on the planning portal. So here's a bit more detailed information. Classes A, B and C focus on dwelling, houses, alterations. Classes D and E focus on EV charging, and classes A to I on renewable installations. So they cover things like solar on a dwelling house, standalone solar panels, ground source heat pumps, water source heat pumps, biomass boiler fuse, CHP flues, air source heat pumps, wind turbines on a building, and freestanding wind turbines. So they cover off most of the requirements that you would have for retrofit. What we haven't got here is permitted development rights on EWI, and in effect, we'll pick that up as we move forward. But in some instances, you may be able to put that down under permitted development. I did mention just a minute ago the difference between dwelling houses and flats. If you live in a converted house in a flat, you actually do not have any permitted development rights. So you have to apply for planning permission if you want to extend, do most of the things that were on that list that you can do. You may not be able to do a loft extension if you're in a ground floor flat, but it's worth noting that it's not quite the same as in a dwelling house. So do have a look into that if you're looking at improving flats. So what can restrict permitted development rights? Conservation areas. So they are restricted in your conservation area. You have to seek what the local planning guidance is. Most planning authorities will have guidance for each of their conservation areas. The conservation areas are designated and they have to have something available for those. So you can normally go onto the planning website, go onto the conservation, listed buildings conservation, and they'll normally have a list of PDFs that you can download, and they should have some indication of what the interest is in that local area. So you do have to put an application in for conservation areas, and it is a paid for application as well. If it's a listed building, which is in a conservation area, you do not need to pay for your planning application. But if you have a listed building, you have no permitted development rights, and you will have to go through that process of getting approval anyway. Areas of outstanding natural beauty, similar restrictions to the conservation area. They're really focused on preserving the environment in that ANOB area. So I know that several years ago, and I'm not up to date with what the position is in Pembrokeshire National Park, but for a while the Pembrokeshire National Park did not want to see solar panels, and they actually used to fly planes over the national park to see if they could spot solar panels on roofs, so that they could go and ask people to take them down. Hopefully they've changed their position on solar panels since sort of 15 years ago. Finally, on this one, we've got Article 4 directions. Now, these are a local planning tool that can be used to bring in specific restrictions around the use of permitted development rights. And we will have a look at that in a bit more detail shortly. They are similar to conservation areas and AONBs, but they are not the same and need to be considered separately to conservation areas. Okay, so we talked a little bit about listed buildings. So you have to submit a planning permission for any works, or generally any works on a listed building, and that would it does depend on the listing status. So I've certainly worked on some properties where the listing status is literally the front wall of the building, inside and out. Anything else, they haven't really cared about what you do, but anything to do with fixings onto that wall, yes, they're very interested to know what you're planning to do. So it really comes down to what the listing states as to kind of what you can do, what you can't do, but you will have to still submit an application for that. Other previous planning conditions can also impact and restrict permitted development rights. So if there's been previous application where it's stated you're going to use this material or this finish, that may impact a request to change things in the future. It's worth asking, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee something. And there is potential conditions to remove a PDR for a particular site. So it is really important that we engage with local planning office as soon as possible, or we employ an architect or a planning consultant who has a good relationship with our local planning offices. Normally, if you work with local architects, they do know the local requirements inside out because they do a lot of work locally. If you employed a national organisation, they'll have a really good overview of what the national conditions are, but they won't necessarily know the details that each local authority use. So, there's pros and cons to both. So the Article 4 direction, so this is, as I said, a regulation under the Town and Country Planning Act, and it's a tool used by local planning authorities to control development and alterations in specific areas. So it can be used to restrict permitted development rights, that minor changes that householders might want to make to their property, thinking that they don't need to do a planning application, but they do. So often it will be things like you may have a row of, so I'm going to use an example in Bristol, a row of terrace houses where they're all the original brick fronted house. There's been no cladding on that street. There's been no terrible types of windows installed. So they're pretty consistent as a terrace. And so the local authority might decide we're going to put an Article 4 on there. And if you want to change your windows, we might stipulate that you need to get approval for at least the fenestration. They might be more than happy to use UPVC, but want a particular style of UPVC to be installed. So that's the kind of environment that you can do them. So even though, you're not in a conservation area, you're not a listed building, lots of homeowners think, great, I can do this under permitted development rights. They'll go onto the planning portal and go, oh, yeah, that's fine. Actually, it might be that in that area they need to seek advice and approval for the works that they want to do. Certainly on that example I gave, you would not be able to put external wall insulation on that street that I mentioned because it was consistent. It hadn't got any cladding. In terms of doing external wall insulation on the back of the houses, local authority didn't care. So that was absolutely acceptable, but not, it was going to impact the visual appearance and the character of that specific street, and therefore they didn't want to have those changes made under permitted development. So there are three different types of direction. So directions affecting conservation areas, directions affecting only listed buildings, and directions affecting other land. I think it's also worth noting that houses of multiple occupation can be used control the impact of HMOs in particular areas. So you can use Article 4 direction can restrict the number of HMOs or the size of the HMOs in particular areas to manage the growth of HMOs in that particular area. There are parts of the country where you've got loads of HMOs in a particular area, and it can really disrupt the kind of feel of a local area. So the impact of an Article 4 direction, so planning may be required for development that would otherwise have been permitted development. I think that's the key requirement. So here, go back to that comment that I've made several times already. Engaging with your local planning authority early as possible is key to understand what all the restrictions are that may come in and impact your retrofit proposals. You can get a lawful development certificate. This is a bit like putting a planning application in. It's a little bit cheaper than a planning application at £129, but it essentially gives you approval to proceed with permitted development. If you're unsure, it's definitely worth doing one of these, particularly if there's that requirement under the Article 4. So essentially, it's very much like submitting a planning application. It's quite often just the same document that you would normally submit, but it goes through that process, and I do believe it's exactly the same length of time process. I have known them to be turned around in 4 weeks though, and essentially they'll come back and confirm whether you can proceed with the works that you're proposing without a planning application and approval. So it can be worth it in areas where you're like, yeah, we can do this. We've spoken to the team, but we want some assurance that we're not going to get somebody come back to us in a year's time saying, oh, you weren't allowed to make those changes there. So it's really worth doing on certain areas where there may be that kind of grey area of what's allowed and what isn't. Okay, let's have a look at some of the retrofit measures. Normally, any internal changes don't require planning permission. So that would cover things like internal wall insulation, draft proofing, and other internal improvements. So position of radiators, potentially position of ventilation units, that type of activity. External changes probably will require planning in most instances. Again, it really depends on the property, the location, and the local authority. In the main, solar panels should not be an issue, but I also know places where they are not allowed on the road, on the roof facing the road, which if you've got the south facing or east west facing roof at the back and it's your garden, fantastic, you can get a solar system put on your house. If you happen to be on the opposite side of the road, oh sorry, no, you can't have it. So it doesn't seem particularly a fair approach in most instances, particularly outside of conservation areas. Air source heat pumps, you have had to, in many instances, seek approval for the positioning of the condenser unit outside the house, again, if it's on a public highway. Again, there are proposals to change that so that you can site that more easily and within 1 metre, or I think now, of a boundary wall, whereas previously I think it was 3. So there are some changes proposed for that. And then again, for things like thermally efficient windows, again, in the main, this is not an issue. This normally comes into play only where there's conservation areas or listed building or potentially ANOBs. But again, worth checking whether there's an Article 4 in place. Worth going back to this one with internal changes. Listed buildings, check the listing before you assume anything on the inside isn't listed. I've known Georgian houses with 1960s fireplaces, 1930s fireplaces, sorry, that have appeared on the listing, and the conservation officer has said, no, you can't take that out. It's on the listing, even though it's not congruous to the other activity in design in that particular building. So external wall insulation is one of the areas where people aren't really sure whether they can get permitted development rights. Sorry, I'm trying to get my words muddled up. And so there are some kind of general rules of thumb that you can go on. Again, it's worth speaking to the local planning office if you're not sure. So as a rule, if you have exposed stone or exposed brick on a front visible elevation, is normally the front or side elevation, something that is visible from the street, the answer is that you're unlikely to be able to put external wall insulation on that elevation. The property might be listed under Article 4. I gave you an example earlier of that sort of thing. The property may have exposed or painted brick and stone fronts. This, again, it really depends on the locality. Sometimes where the bricks are painted, they actually don't mind because they go, well, it's not that dissimilar to render, so that's absolutely fine. You can go with that approach. In other areas, they might kind of think that maybe in the future, somebody might want to clean the paint off, so they might say no. They might just say no, that they don't want it on that elevation because it just changes the sort of the line of the facade, because the EWI would pull that line out slightly compared to houses around it. Where a property abuts a highway, so it could be front elevation more consistently, particularly with solid wall properties, as side elevations onto the pavement. This will need approval from the highways team. This can normally be done under planning application. Sometimes you can get approval, pre-approval from the highways team, or a guidance before you submit your application. But in effect, you are kind of, it's not quite a flying lease, but you are flying over the highways. So you are impacting the width of that particular pavement. And in this instance, it's the local council might have a blanket no. They might make it based on the width of the highway. The impact of that might be based on how busy that street is. Is it on a bus route? Is it cluttered with lots of other street debris? There's like multiple reasons why they might want to have a look at it and say yes or no. I've seen really narrow pavements where the house has EWI on that gable wall, and you think, wow, that pavement's only like 450 mil wide, and they've taken up like 80 mil of it with EWI, but actually it's really not a busy area. There's not much footfall, so it's not really impacting anything. And then you can go around the corner and you've got a 2-meter like pavement, but it's on a bus route, and the local authority has said no, you can't put your EWI there. So again, really worth checking into that. On the whole, rendered, pebble dashed or ashlar marked properties are less likely to need planning permission. It is also always worth checking in with your local authority to see if they have approved that approach. So we've got a few examples here, and I'm going to welcome people to either, Ben, if you can let them come off of, use their microphones, or put in the chat what you think the examples might be for any of these particular examples. Here we've got a listed building, property and conservation area, modern house, and we're talking about what would the impact be for air source heat pump, solar PV, EWI and new windows. So the restriction possibly on the modern house is you may be asked for approval of the finishes for the EWI on that house, and you've got these brick coins in the corners of that gable end, so they would probably want to see those replicated. In they've also got, I think, a soldier course and maybe a soldier course type sill area, or I can't really see from here, but obviously it's a different color, so they would probably want to see you replicate that either in a render finish or in a slipped a brick slip finish on that one to retain the look of that house, with part of it on the right above the door and garage still being rendered. So I think that would be the approach. I suspect that house is probably cavity wall, and you probably wouldn't want to put EWI on it anyway, but that's by the by. I think in terms of looking at those two other pictures, I mean, I would be very surprised if you were allowed to do anything on the listed building, or very much on any of those properties in that conservation area either. Perhaps solar panels out the back, and perhaps an air source heat pump, as long as you could site the condenser out the back. You might have to put in secondary glazed windows on all of those if you wanted to improve them. So you'd certainly have to have those conversations up front and see what you're allowed to do. So thank you for participating. We'll move on. Planning application timelines. So here's a kind of whole process. So we're looking at pre-application advice. Sometimes if you want pre-application advice, you have to ask for it and pay for it. Some local authorities don't offer that service. Some of them have such a long waiting list. It's quite painful to get there. I did work a long time ago in Westminster, and they had a really long waiting list. It was very challenging, and we did have to pay up front. And I think their planning pre-application advice was based on the value of the works, so it was quite pricey. You have to do a preparation of the application, submission of the application. It then goes into this consultation period. There may be a site visit, particularly if it's a sort of contentious proposal. Then there will be a further assessment of the application, and then there will be a decision made. Now, what we want most of the time is a decision made by the officer, because that's a determined outcome. If we go to planning committee, there's always a risk that it won't get approved. So where we can, if we can get an officer to sign it off, it's actually a lot better for us. And then there is always the option to appeal. If you are going to appeal, depending on what the proposal is, you need to have quite a good understanding of the planning process, the planning law to put a good appeal together. Just going back with the same information is probably not going to get you anywhere. And as we know, it can take a lot of money to go through an appeal process. If you're doing large developments, local governments are really not a big fan of appeals. It costs them a lot of money. So they really don't like doing them. I'm not saying that that's a route anyone should take because of, just appeal because it costs them a lot of money. But it is interesting that they're quite nervous about that. And it's currently at £258 for an application for a single property. It will change depending on the type, the number of properties, the scale of the work, that type of thing. Okay, what we got, pre-application advice. So we need to seek advice from the local planning authority. They will give advice based on local and national policy. They will let you know about permitted development rights. They'll let you know about hopefully that Article 4 and the validation requirements and whether the fee is something that needs to be paid for that application. Then you need to prepare the application. So you need to set detailed plans. They normally ask for a site plan, which is probably either 1 to 2,500 or 1 to 1,250 as a minimum. Sometimes they're asking for a block plan. Probably for a retrofit, you won't be asked for a block plan, but that's where it's normally like 1 to 500. So it's much more detailed. So you'd have to purchase those from Ordnance Survey. And then you need to have plans and elevations as existing and then as proposed. If you are changing the floor layout, that's much more important that you include those plan layouts. If you're not, and it's an exterior amend only, perhaps to the wall finish, then sometimes you can get away without having the plan. But from my point of view, I just think it takes down one of those barriers for them to say, oh, you haven't provided us with the information that we want. So it's really important that we have some technical drawings. You see all sorts of things that go into a local authority. It's really helpful to have a properly drawn up design with key measurements included on them. It is only for planning, but things like narrow sideways, that could impact a decision if you can't demonstrate that you've got enough clearance to get down a sideway, and that sort of stuff. I think it's also really important that when you're submitting the application, which is the next slide, so we'll come on to it, that you have fulfilled all the requirements that they're looking for. There is a specific form that you need to complete. It's pretty straightforward, doesn't take long. So okay, so I mentioned it on the other one. So some applications you'll need to complete your disability statement as well. So if you're literally just changing windows, you can normally put a very short note in saying there's no changes to the access to this building, it's remaining the same. You might have to do a sustainability assessment as well with your application. So I mean, where we're doing energy efficiency improvements, that should be relatively straightforward to add in things like, this is predicted to reduce the energy consumption of this building by X amount. So that's part of your sustainability application. I think with new development, even any new development on a domestic scale requires biodiversity net gain at the moment. So I think we'll probably see some changes to BNG requirements over the next few years as it's sort of the pain threshold has gone through by people, and we work up a sort of easier approach is worked up. But at the moment, it is a requirement on all applications. Shouldn't be, I don't think, for retrofit. So then there's the publicity and consultation periods. So that's when all the neighbours of the property will get sent letters letting them know that there's a proposal to do some work on that property, and they'll have a link to the planning portal where they can go and have a look at the proposals and lodge some complaint if they want to, or just concerns to the local authority that they feel is important that they take into consideration. So quite often it's not like necessarily I don't want you to do this work, it's just like the concern over a particular aspect that might impact and how it can be improved. So it's not always bad it's not always going to stop a proposal going through if people complain. If it's like, you've got 20 neighbours and one of them complains, chances are that you probably be fine going through with that proposal. There may be a site visit, particularly, as I said, if there are areas of particular importance that they're concerned about the impact. And then, as I said, there's an assessment application. So they'll go through the planning officer will have a look at your assessment against policy and any site visit and consultation feedback. They'll consider any material considerations to the proposal, loss of sunlight, etc. There may be a period where they want to come back to you and negotiate changes to the proposal. It's really good if you can get negotiated changes during that initial planning application. Sometimes they come back and they just cancel they don't provide you with approval, and then you have to go through the process again, and then you have to go back to them and try and get out of them why they wouldn't approve the document. So if they offer you an opportunity to discuss how to improve the proposal or make some changes or just change the colour or perhaps the finish on it, it's always useful to take those opportunities and try and work with the planning officer to find an agreed outcome, and then they'll normally just sign it off, and it's a quicker process. So as it says here, it's important to remain proactive and open to suggestions. If you're difficult, you're going to get a really difficult outcome quite often from a planning officer if they don't agree or don't like part of your proposal. As I said, there is always an option for it to go to planning committee. So that may happen with certain size projects. If we're looking at individual householder projects, it's unlikely in the main to go to a planning committee. And then we've talked about an appeal. It can take 12 weeks. It probably takes longer, in all honesty, but there's a statutory requirement for appealing. And I think we're nearly at the end. So some tips here: make sure you check what your local guidance is, check for conservation areas, have a look for Article 4 directions, work with your local authorities to make sure what permitted development rights are applicable still for the properties you're working on. And then some top tips for preparing the application. Start early. Don't leave it to 12 weeks before you want to start on site. Because things are likely not to go that quickly. As with all things, the more data you have, the more information on your property, the better. I would also say that includes anything that's in the public domain on the local authority site, because if you are working in conservation areas or listed building status, that information will be available to you online through your local planning office. Depending on the type of work you're looking for, you might want to employ a planning consultant. They are very expensive, just to let you know, but they are very useful in certain situations. You do need to get your application validated. I think that's the right word. If you don't, it's sat there and it's not in that statutory period. So if you've sent in an application, it's 6 weeks down the line, you haven't heard anything, it hasn't been approved. So, you need to phone up and speak to the planning team and say, oh, I sent in an application on this date, I haven't heard anything about it. Could you follow it up? If you're submitting via the planning portal, you normally get a reference there as to what the planning submission was. You might need to account for planning committee cycles. So if it does need to go to committee, that might extend that period, that statutory period. There is a cost and time element. And we've already talked at length about visual impact on the surrounding area, and we haven't talked about this, but any breach of the planning control can result in enforcement. So we often hear these stories of people that have been told to tear their house down or tear their extension down, and there's this big sob story in the paper about it, and to some extent it is really unfortunate, but when you look through that, normally they've never sought planning approval, or they've built, I think there was a man that built a house inside a barn, and he lived in there for a certain amount of time until somebody found out that he was living in there, and he built a whole house inside the barn which didn't have approval. And I think if you I can't remember the amount of years, but if you have the house up for 10 to 20 years, something like that, you automatically then got approval. So he was hoping that was going to happen. It got found out, and then he had to pull it down, and he was very unhappy. But you know, he knew that he couldn't get approval, likely, which is why he hid his house in the barn. So you know, you sob stories. Where do you want to go with them? Anyway, that's, maybe I'm harsh. And we've got some resources here. So some upcoming events that you might be interested in, sort of aligned to some degree with planning and retrofit projects. And then just as a reminder that we have a lot of resources on our website, on-demand resources, various different clean presentations and toolkits, no, not really toolkits, other materials that you can access from our website. So that's the end of the, I hope you found it helpful today, and it's been a pleasure to speak to you all, and I hope you have a really good Thursday afternoon.